The stale air hit me like a wall. After weeks of recycled cabin air and sterile hotel atmospheres, I craved nothing more than the familiar scent of my own home, the faint lingering notes of lavender from my diffuser, the subtle mustiness of my vintage book collection. Instead, I was assaulted by a pungent cocktail of Axe body spray, day-old burger grease, and something vaguely reminiscent of dirty gym socks. My stomach churned, not just from the jet lag, but from the unsettling feeling that I was intruding on someone else's space. The lights blazing upstairs only amplified the sensation. My gate was ajar, a careless invitation where it should have been a secure barrier. My trash bins were haphazardly strewn near the curb, a stark contrast to my meticulously organized routine. And the silence from my motion sensor camera was deafening. It usually chirped with notifications every time a stray cat dared to cross my driveway. Dragging my wheeled suitcase behind me, I crept up the driveway, each crunch of the gravel under the wheels a painful announcement of my arrival. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling slightly. The front door creaked open, revealing a scene that sent a jolt of pure disbelief through my system. It was as if a bomb of teenage chaos had exploded in my tastefully decorated living room. Crumbs littered the plush rug I had painstakingly chosen. A greasy stain marred the elegant cream upholstery of my couch, and my meticulously curated record collection was scattered like fallen leaves, the sleeve of my prized first edition Miles Davis album bent and torn. My vintage record player, usually perched reverently on its stand, was now precariously balanced on a stack of pizza boxes, its delicate needle likely grinding against some forgotten vinyl. But the most egregious offense was the monstrous gaming console, a garish black behemoth with glowing neon accents, dominating the space beneath my carefully mounted 65-inch OLED TV. It was an alien presence, a declaration of war against my carefully cultivated aesthetic. A pair of mismatched sneakers lay abandoned near the doorway, one adorned with a cartoon character I didn't recognize, and the other displaying a brand logo that screamed fast fashion. Someone had clearly made themselves at home, and that someone was decidedly not me. Then, piercing through the unsettling silence, came the sound of raucous laughter. It resonated from upstairs, a wave of youthful exuberance that shattered the fragile bubble of disbelief I had been desperately clinging to. A primal surge of protectiveness, a fierce defense of my invaded sanctuary coursed through me. I needed to know who dared to occupy my home, to desecrate my space, to treat my haven with such blatant disrespect. I scanned the room for a weapon, my eyes landing on the tall, slender floor lamp standing innocently in the corner. It was hardly a medieval mace, but it would have to do. Gripping the cool metal shaft with both hands, I began to ascend the stairs, each step a quiet promise of confrontation. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, as I neared the top. The scene that greeted me in my guest room was so absurd, so utterly surreal, that for a moment, I questioned my own sanity. Bathed in the glow of a blaring cartoon, some hyperkinetic anime featuring characters with gravity-defying hair and weapons that seemed to defy the laws of physics, sat a figure that could only be described as a grotesque parody of domesticity. Trevor, Karen's perpetually unemployed, aggressively entitled son, was sprawled across my meticulously made guest bed, clad only in a pair of faded boxer shorts patterned with cartoon skulls. A half-eaten bowl of sugary cereal rested precariously on his ample belly, the sugary milk threatening to spill onto my pristine white duvet. A thick, unkempt beard obscured most of his face, but the glint of defiance in his eyes was unmistakable. Trevor, the notorious loudmouth who had once called the cops on my cousin for the crime of walking while black, was now comfortably ensconced in my home, acting as if he owned the place. The sheer audacity of the situation momentarily robbed me of my voice. This was not a mistaken identity, a simple misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of trespass, a brazen invasion of my privacy. I finally found my voice, the words emerging as a strangled hiss. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Trevor, startled by my sudden appearance, looked up with an expression that bordered on genuine offense. He regarded me as if I were the intruder, the uninvited guest disrupting his peaceful morning. He blinked slowly, a dollop of milk clinging precariously to his beard, and then delivered the line that would forever be etched in the annals of my most bizarre life experiences. "I live here now," he declared, his voice thick with self-satisfaction. He spoke with such conviction, such unwavering certainty, that for a fleeting moment, I almost believed him. Almost. But the reality of the situation quickly reasserted itself. This was my house, my sanctuary, my carefully constructed haven. And this entitled, freeloading parasite had somehow managed to infiltrate it and claim it as his own. He proceeded to elaborate on his audacious claim, explaining, with nauseating casualness, that he had left his toxic mom and decided that my house would be a suitable replacement. He reasoned that since I was never around, news to me, considering I worked hard to afford this place and had plenty of room, his relocation was a perfectly natural solution. He spoke as if my property were some kind of charitable boarding house, a refuge for suburban misfits fleeing the consequences of their own poor choices. The gall of this kid was astounding. My blood began to boil, a slow, simmering rage that threatened to erupt at any moment. "Get out!" I demanded, my voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "Get out of my house! Now!" Trevor, unfazed by my escalating anger, simply shrugged his broad shoulders and took another spoonful of cereal. He chewed slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the cartoon. "Can't," he mumbled through a mouthful of sugary flakes. "Squatters' rights." He actually said squatters' rights, as if watching a few YouTube videos had transformed him into a legal expert. The level of entitlement was mind-boggling. He then proceeded to reach for my phone on the nightstand, the final act of defiance that pushed me over the edge. With the casual confidence of someone who had never earned a dime in his life, he dialed 911. "Yeah," he drawled into the phone, his voice dripping with false innocence. "There's a stranger threatening me in my house." He paused, allowing the gravity of his lie to hang in the air. My house. There I stood, in the hallway of my own home, the very home I had poured my heart and soul into creating, next to the very framed diplomas that represented years of hard work and sacrifice, listening to this obese, bearded man-child calmly and deliberately fabricate a narrative designed to turn me into the villain in my own life. The absurdity of the situation was almost comical, a scene ripped straight from a low-budget sitcom, but the underlying threat was very real. I was a black woman standing in my own home, about to be confronted by law enforcement based on the false accusations of a known racist. History had taught me the potential consequences of that scenario, and fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my anger. I took a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I needed to remain calm, to present myself as the rational, law-abiding citizen that I was. I forced myself to remember the details, the key pieces of evidence that would prove my case. My ID, my mortgage statements, the security footage. The security footage was crucial. I had installed cameras throughout the property precisely for situations like this. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that they had captured Trevor's initial entry into my home. The 10 minutes that followed Trevor's 911 call felt like an eternity. I paced the hallway, my anxiety growing with each passing second. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside my window, sounded like the approach of the police sirens. My mind raced, trying to anticipate every possible scenario, every question I might be asked. Finally, the sirens arrived, their wailing cries tearing through the quiet suburban neighborhood. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, their flashing lights painting the front of my house in a dizzying kaleidoscope of red and blue. 2 officers emerged, their faces grim and professional. I met them at the door, my hands raised in a gesture of placation. "Officers," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I can explain everything." I proceeded to calmly and methodically lay out the situation, presenting them with my driver's license, my mortgage statement, and the access codes to my security system. I explained that I had just returned from a business trip, that I had discovered Trevor living in my house without my permission, and that he had falsely claimed to be the homeowner. The officers listened intently, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a young woman with a stern demeanor, typed something into her handheld device. The other, a burly man with a weathered face, turned to Trevor, who was now standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. "Sir," the officer said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We need to hear your side of the story." Trevor launched into his rehearsed narrative, painting himself as the victim of a crazed intruder, a vulnerable young man terrorized in his own home. He even managed to squeeze out a few crocodile tears, claiming that I had threatened him and vandalized his personal belongings. The officers exchanged a look, a silent communication that I couldn't decipher. Then, the young female officer spoke. "Sir," she said to Trevor, "we need to see some identification." Trevor fumbled in his pockets, producing a crumpled driver's license with a sheepish grin. The officer took the license and typed the information into her device. A moment later, her eyes widened slightly. She turned to her partner and spoke in a low voice, a tone that I couldn't quite catch. The burly officer nodded and then turned back to me. "Ma'am," he said, "can you show us the security footage you mentioned?" Relief washed over me. This was it, the moment of truth. I led them to my home office, where I accessed the security system and played back the footage from the previous 4 days. There it was, clear as day. Trevor sneaking onto my property in the dead of night, lugging a duffel bag and 3 large pizzas, forcing open the back sliding door with a crowbar he'd pulled from his bag. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as the officers watched the security footage unfold. Trevor, standing behind them, shifted uncomfortably, the smugness slowly draining from his face. The footage didn't lie. It showed him breaking and entering, clear as day. It showed him unpacking his belongings, rearranging my furniture, and generally treating my house as his own personal playground. When the footage ended, the officers turned to Trevor, their expressions now decidedly less neutral. "Mr. Trevor's last name," the burly officer said, his voice hardening. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Trevor stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He tried to backtrack, claiming that he had misunderstood the situation, that he had thought I had given him permission to stay there. But the officers weren't buying it. The footage was irrefutable evidence of his illegal entry. Then, he tried another tactic, claiming that his dad said he could live there. This was a particularly absurd lie since his father had absolutely no connection to me or my property. In fact, I had never even met the man. The young female officer sighed and shook her head. "Sir," she said, "you are going to have to come with us." But before they could place him under arrest, the burly officer decided to run a routine check on Trevor's name in the system. And that's when things took an even stranger turn. The officer's eyes widened as he scrolled through the information on his handheld device. He looked at me, then back at Trevor, then back at me again. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with surprise, "did you know that Mr. Trevor's last name has filed a change of address form with the post office listing this address as his new residence?" I stared at him in disbelief. Trevor had actually gone to the trouble of officially changing his address to my house? The audacity was simply staggering. He was actively attempting to create a paper trail to solidify his claim as a legal resident. But the surprises didn't end there. The officer continued to scroll through the information, his expression growing increasingly incredulous. "And," he added, "it appears that he has also listed this address on a recent job application, under current residence." The officer explained that this had triggered an active fraud alert from a background check company. Apparently, Trevor was also trying to open utilities, gas, electricity, water, under my name. He was attempting to steal my identity, to financially siphon off my resources. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a case of trespassing. This was a premeditated, calculated attempt to defraud me, to steal my identity, to take over my life. The officers looked at me, their faces a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. I looked at them, my mind reeling from the sheer scope of Trevor's criminal behavior. And then, we heard it. The screech of tires, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up to the curb at high speed. Karen. She burst out of her car like a tornado, her face a mask of fury and concern. She took one look at the police cruisers parked in front of my house, and exploded. "What's going on here?" she shrieked, her voice piercing the air. "What are you doing to my poor baby?" She launched into a tirade, accusing me of traumatizing her precious Trevor, of harassing him, of somehow being responsible for his presence in my home. She even had the gall to suggest that I should be honored to provide temporary refuge to someone in need. She actually used those words, as if I should be grateful for the opportunity to house her freeloading, identity-stealing son. She attempted to hug Trevor, wrapping her arms around him in a possessive embrace, as if he were some kind of charity case, a victim of circumstance. It was a pathetic display, a desperate attempt to deflect attention from her son's criminal behavior. But the officers were not swayed by Karen's theatrics. The burly officer stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "we are investigating a possible break-in, fraud, and attempted identity theft. We need you to step back and allow us to do our job." Karen, however, was not to be deterred. She continued to rant and rave, demanding to know why her son was being persecuted, why I was making such a big deal out of a simple misunderstanding. The young female officer, clearly losing patience, pulled out her notepad and began to read aloud the details of the report, listing each of Trevor's offenses: the break-in, the change of address fraud, the attempted identity theft. As she recited the litany of his crimes, Karen's face underwent a dramatic transformation. The fury slowly gave way to disbelief, then to embarrassment, and finally to a dawning sense of horror. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. Her poor baby was not the innocent victim she had imagined. He was a criminal, a fraudster, a liar. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and shaken. When the officers moved to detain Trevor, he suddenly turned on his mother, spitting out a torrent of accusations and recriminations. He claimed that he didn't even want to live with her anymore, that she was suffocating him, that she was the reason he had run away in the first place. He even had the audacity to claim that I owed him for all the trauma his mom caused. It was a stunning betrayal, a desperate attempt to shift the blame and avoid the consequences of his actions. Karen, stung by his words, snapped. Fueled by a mixture of anger, humiliation, and years of pent-up frustration, she slapped Trevor across the face, right there on my front lawn. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a sharp, decisive crack that silenced everyone. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos, a culmination of all the tension and absurdity that had been building throughout the morning. Two birds, one meltdown. The officers immediately separated them, one officer escorting a sputtering Trevor to the patrol car, the other attempting to calm a hysterical Karen. The burly officer, shaking his head in disbelief, turned to me and sighed. "Ma'am," he said, "this is the weirdest eviction I've ever done." They escorted Trevor out of my property, his voice rising in a crescendo of angry shouts and threats. He screamed that this wasn't over, that he would get revenge, that his generation is rising. It was a bizarre and unsettling spectacle, a glimpse into the twisted mindset of someone who believed he was entitled to everything and responsible for nothing. Karen, meanwhile, was issued a fine for obstructing the investigation and was warned never to step foot on my property again. As she drove away, defeated and humiliated, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pity? No, not pity, perhaps a sense of grim satisfaction. They would both have to pay for what they did. As the police cars drove away, their sirens fading into the distance, I stood on my front porch, surveying the scene. My lawn was scarred with tire tracks, my flower beds trampled, and my nerves shot. The aftermath of the chaos was a stark reminder of the ordeal I had just endured. The sense of violation was palpable, a lingering stain on my sanctuary. I knew that I couldn't truly relax until I had taken steps to reclaim my space and ensure that nothing like this could ever happen again. The first order of business was to assess the damage. I walked through my house, room by room, taking inventory of the items that had been damaged or destroyed. The greasy stain on my couch, the scratches on my record player, the missing silverware, each item a painful reminder of Trevor's intrusion. The cost to repair and replace everything would be significant, but the emotional toll was even greater. I spent the next few hours cleaning and scrubbing, trying to erase every trace of Trevor's presence. I bleached the countertops, sanitized the bathrooms, and vacuumed every inch of carpet. I threw out the cereal bowl he had used, the pizza boxes he had discarded, the stained towels he had left on the floor. I wanted to purge my house of his energy, to restore it to its original state of peace and tranquility. But I knew that cleaning alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to take concrete steps to secure my property, to protect myself from future threats. The next day, I contacted a security company and scheduled the installation of 2 additional security cameras, strategically placed to cover the blind spots in my existing system. I also upgraded my motion alarm system, adding sensors to every door and window. I wanted to create an impenetrable fortress, a deterrent to any would-be intruders. Finally, I decided to commemorate the experience, to transform it into a lesson, a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the power of resilience. I took one of my favorite quotes, a passage from Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, and had it printed on a small plaque. I hung the plaque in my entryway, where I would see it every time I entered my home. The words served as a constant reminder that even in the face of adversity, I could rise above the chaos, reclaim my power, and protect my peace. Now, as I sit here, weeks after the incident, I can finally breathe a sigh of relief. The security cameras are humming, the alarm system is armed, and my house is once again my sanctuary. Karen and Trevor are gone, banished from my life. And while the memory of their intrusion will always linger, it will also serve as a reminder of my strength, my resilience, and my unwavering determination to protect what is mine.